right, we are now in the final half of the book of Revelation. We've been talking so far. We've gone through several series. We're going to go approach another series right now. But it's also important for us because we're also going to get to a very confusing portion here in the books. We're going to get to the portion dealing with the bowls of wrath, and of course the sixth bowl contains the Battle of Armageddon. So we will be talking about the Battle of Armageddon, and the good news is for all of you who are here or watching online, the good news is that we will finally tell you where the Battle of Armageddon will take place. All right, so let's get started.
Is this online?
Oh yes, we're posting all of this online.
On St. Peter's?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so we've got the dragon and the woman, the pretender to the throne, and the seven bowls of wrath. Now the woman and the dragon. Who is this woman? This is a question that we have as we look at this. John is using apocalyptic language. Apocalyptic language is almost like prophetic language on steroids, of course. And so what John is trying to ask us here is he's trying to frame everything in this wonderful language. Now, we don't like poetry. It's not to the point. It's difficult to read poetry. You have to actually read it several times. And of course there are meanings layered upon meanings, but it is very important for us to think about this because we're trying to view so often the book of Revelation as if it is an instruction manual when it's probably closer to reading poetry. And you know you're going to get into a lot of trouble if you have a bunch of people with kind of an engineering mindset or a decoding mindset trying to read poetry. So who is this woman? Well, some people speculate that this woman mentioned here is Mary, the mother of Jesus. On one level, this seems to make sense. Obviously, she's bearing the one who will rule the world with a rod of iron, as it says here, which is taken from Scripture. But there are some problems with this notion. First off, this seems to be a little bit too on the nose, doesn't it? Just to say, well, this person represents the actual person who will bear Christ. Plus, the supernatural aspects of it tend to lend themselves to a more imaginative reading of it. And so it would seem a little anticlimactic to think of Mary. So what we're saying is that Mary's journey doesn't happen like this woman's journey does precisely. I think we can rule Mary out. The church? Well, this would seem to make sense as well. I mean, it is more imaginative. And we do, as many people put it, we do bear Christ with us and bear Christ to the world. We are persecuted for our faith and for our beliefs, or we are scorned or chased or whatever, hounded by the devil. But there's some problems here too. Number one, we aren't the ones who create Christ. And secondly, the church is going to be referenced later on. Now, there's nothing wrong with using multiple images. John himself uses multiple images to reiterate or to look at an issue from a different point of view. But I think the image of the bride of Christ conflicts with the mother of Christ here. And it conflicts just too much for it to be the imaginative use or to be that particular image that's being used here. Is it Christians then? Well, on one level we run into the same problem we run into with the church. So I think we can rule Christians out as well. Is it the Jewish community? We have to be careful here, of course, because there have been fights within this community. This early community, though, would have considered them themselves to be Jewish people who happen to believe the Messiah had already arrived. And they themselves are finding that they're at loggerheads with their fellow Jews who don't believe that the Messiah has come, and certainly don't believe the Messiah has come in the person of Jesus Christ. So I think we can rule out the Jewish community, since it seems to be a little bit too divergent from the story that John is trying to tell. Instead, we should look at this as God's Israel. Now, if we read through the Old Testament, the way that God talks about Israel is that he's raising this group of people out, this community. Indeed, the Bible itself, whenever it speaks of the nation of Israel, speaks of the congregation of Israel. It's not the nation of Israel, it's the congregation of Israel. And so it's this giant worshiping community that God has called forth, indeed has created, has fashioned. He often refers to this community when it becomes wayward as being being like a spouse that has been unfaithful. And finally, we need to remember that the whole purpose that we believe in the person of Jesus Christ in declaring talking about the Old Testament, what we see there is the purpose of that community, that congregation being gathered together, was that it was supposed to give birth to the Messiah and the whole messianic promise. This is further underlined by the descriptions that we see here. We see that in Revelation, we hear the echoes of the description here from Genesis chapter 37, verse 9. In this passage, Joseph is talking about his own vision, this vision of that he will have the sun and the moon bow down before him, as well as the stars, the other stars. And again, that comes to pass with him, but here the 12 stars would represent the completion or completeness of the Israel tribes. It's also the sun and the moon is supposed to reflect that imagery that comes about there in the book of Genesis. So we would think that this person is supposed to represent the family of Jacob, of Israel, indeed. And so that's one clue into the identity of the woman. We're told that there will be a birth in an age of strife. And again, this woman in these passages here is alluded to as someone who will birth a child into an age of strife. And that is what we are seeing here, or going to see here in just a moment. So once again, that woman is supposed to represent Israel. And then we are told in Exodus 19:4 that the congregation of Israel, the people of Israel, have been born into the wilderness on eagle's wings, which is almost exactly or very explicitly what John is trying to get across here as the personification of Israel, of God's congregation of Israel, is born into the wilderness on eagle's wings. So it seems most likely that this is supposed to be the true called Israel that God has planned and is planning on bearing the Messiah. So let's talk about dragons now. I don't need to tell you that I lost a good deal of time researching dragons. It is a fascinating subject. Dragons appear in almost every myth in the world, and we don't really know why that is. We have some speculation. Some people speculate that it's a composite of humans' greatest predators, of snakes and of flying creatures grabbing us into the air, and of lions and fierce predatory creatures. Other people think that there could be just all sorts of other reasons for this. But for our cultures, here in the Western cultures especially, broadly speaking, and not just here in cultures that come from, but with the same language traditions, a subgroup of the language is called Indo-European. Dragons represent fear and evil. That's not necessarily the case in cultures outside the Indo-European sphere. So for instance, the Chinese don't have these kinds of understandings about dragons that we would in our culture. But for us, they are the epitome of evil and fear. Also, we have within our traditions, within the Indo-European language traditions, so going all the way from India, Persia, but indeed into Europe as well, stories about heroes vanquishing them. So in the Near East, let's just kind of review the world in which John would be writing and their discussions about dragons. Now, we're not going to get into our modern understanding. Certainly, we're not going to talk about fantasy literature right now. We're not going to talk about Tolkien and Small. We're not going to talk about J.K. Rowling and that sort of thing. Sorry to disappoint everyone. But we are going to talk about the ancient Near East and how they would have understood, as well as the Greco-Roman culture. Again, all of these cultures that we're talking about are what are called the Indo-European language family. And so the Indo-European language family, if you want to think about it, just think about how much language influences the way you think about the world. Think about the way we frame things in English and how our framing of things is different from other areas. Now, to get lost in the high weeds here, let's just get right into it. The Ugarit were a people that were in Asia Minor around the Hittites, and they had discussions. The Hittites were one of the oldest empires, so this is one of the oldest Indo-European groups. They themselves had a story about how Baal, we know who Baal is, he comes into our story as a false idol that is luring people away, the people of Israel away, when they come into Canaan. Of course, no one ever worships a god they believe is not beneficial in some way, shape, or form. And so the people of Canaan, and these people here, the Ugarit-speaking people, they themselves thought Baal was a useful god. Maybe not a good god, but definitely useful for them and to be placated. This story there's a story about how Baal beat the dragon Latanu. Again, these words we're using for dragons aren't like our conceptions of dragons today, which are four-footed, fire-breathing monsters. Instead, they would have been more serpentine, or they may or may not have had wings, just all sorts of different things. The main thing is they are a primordial creature representing fear and evil. The Zoroastrians, they come into the story. We talked about Baal worshippers, the Canaanite people, but the Zoroastrians Zoroastrianism was the religion of the Persians. And of course, the Jewish people had a lot of contact with the Persians after they were overrun by them. And Zoroastrian religion was dualistic. They had an evil god and a good god. And underneath the evil god was a dragon by the name of Azidahaka. I'm probably mispronouncing that name. I'm sorry if I am. He was a subordinate of Ahriman, who was the ultimate god, and in one story he is slain by the hero Rostam. You don't need to remember any of these names, any of these peoples. what you do need to just notice is there's a common theme coming up here. In Egypt, Ra descends into the underworld. Ra is the major god. He's the sun god. He descends into the underworld to fight Apep. Some say that instead of Ra killing him, Set, who is another god, another deity, goes and kills Apep in the underworld. There's also a story that Pharaoh is said to have killed Denwen. Denwen was a dragon who actually threatened all of the Egyptian pantheon, and by Pharaoh killing Denwen, Pharaoh earned the right to live forever being reincarnated. The Old Testament is really interesting, and this is something we should really love about delving into Jewish literature. The mythologies that we see, even in the Greeks, are fantastical, magical. They make for wonderful stories. But the Jewish people are much more seriously minded. One can almost sense that they understand that their language or their writings can be taken to be allegorical. And indeed, that's what we see here in the Old Testament. Dragons aren't necessarily explicitly listed in the Old Testament, but certain creatures seem to be reminiscent of dragons. One of them is the Leviathan, but these creatures in the Old Testament, whether it's Leviathan or Rahab or Behemoth, not Rahab the person in this story of Jericho, but another creature. All of these creatures are tied as having connections with the sea. Now, the sea is much more than just a pretty place you go out and look at. It's not just a place where the shipping comes in. It's not just a place where you gather fish. The sea is also, and most importantly, considered a realm of chaos. If you go shipping, there's no guarantee that your ship would arrive, even though it was the fastest and cheapest way to transport goods. Again, if you're lost at sea, even if we're lost at sea, I think most of us would rather be lost somewhere on the land than lost in the sea, because we feel like we can at least get from one point to another. And so the sea was this chaotic, terrifying place. And so these dragons are the manifestations of the sea itself. As manifestations of the sea themselves, then they're going to be connected with the empires of the world. And you see that through these dragon creatures, the empires of the world are supposed to represent chaos. They're supposed to represent the chaos that is at odds with God. So we see this in Egypt, we see this with Babylon, we see this with Assyria. All of those countries, all of those peoples are considered to be at one with the sea, or at one being against God. Here, the ultimate dragon is Satan. This seems to fit with all of the things we've been talking about with chaos and the forces of chaos, because Satan is, as the ultimate force of chaos, is lying behind all of the false hopes and promises of empire, which is a root theme in the book of Revelation. That the forces of empire, no matter how powerful they may appear, their rule is a stolen rule. Their power is a usurped power, and they will ultimately be defeated by truth and by the power of God. Satan here is expelled from heaven. He slashes out a third of the stars. Some people speculate that the third of the stars represents a third of the angels going down to follow him. That's fine. You can believe that. That may be the case. But what it is also trying to get across primarily is the fact that there's a dimming that is happening. And he is trying to steal the glory, steal the power, steal the stars from the heavens. He pursues the woman and the child. But Michael casts the devil out of heaven. And then the dragon then attempts to wash away the woman, but can't. This is supposed to make us recall various instances where the water does seem like it's going to batter people, God's people, but ultimately they're rescued from it. Story of Noah, for instance, or the story of the people of Israel and the waters from the Red Sea closing in behind them, how they managed to escape through the sea. And so the dry land swallows it up. And again, we're supposed to remember once again the origin story of the people of Israel, how they were called out of Egypt and built into a people of the Lord. I love this quote by Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, the Catholic writer. It says, "Fairy tales do not tell children dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed." And that is the ultimate lesson we should remember from the book of Revelation, that no matter how powerful these dragons, these beasts may appear, they will ultimately meet their end. All right, the beasts from the sea and from the earth. We are supposed to recall Daniel chapter 7 and 8. These beasts reflect this. And it's important for us to bear this in mind because so many people go to their newspapers or wherever they get their information rather than going to Scripture when they're reading Revelation. They look for the signs of the time in our current time. This is a bias they call presentism, that everything that exists in the present is all that we think about. And yet, we should be directed not towards what we're reading in the newspaper per se, but more towards Scripture. And so we go to Daniel chapter 7 and 8, and we read about these beasts emerging from the sea.
Even if you widen that lens from present day or present time to even the last century, you're still being narrow-sighted.
Right.
There's thousands, yeah. So I like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's amazing how myopic we can be.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Bible should call us instead to expand our horizons a little bit. There's a reason why the Bible is written by many different authors with many different genres and many different perspectives. And yet it's the same story. It's the same God. It's looking at God from different angles. And that's been a very interesting thing to discover in the book of Revelation, is how is this very odd book telling a story about redemption and salvation. And so that is what we should take away from this, because as I'm reading it, and maybe it's the Lutheran in me, I'm seeing this is God's grace, there's God's grace, there's God's grace. You know, all of the destruction that might be happening in the world, at the ultimate point, God's grace is available to everyone. And if we could just pause and think back to what we talked about with the trumpets, those were meant to call people to redemption, weren't they? And these stories where we're going to get into with the vessels, the bowls, the vials of wrath, these 7 are supposed to line up with the previous 7 trumpets. And it's interesting to note that as we read through, we'll see at the end, especially tagged onto, I believe, the 5th and 6th bowl, is a declaration that the people should have repented. But even in the midst of the destruction of all the world around them, they still, their hearts, like, again, calling back to the Exodus story, their hearts were hardened. And they just rejected God's rule, God's power, God's enthronement. All right. These characters, as we read through them, the beasts that emerge are supposed to be a mockery. They are mocking God. They are a parody. And isn't evil just a parody of what God has promised for us? to bring in C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, a satire that he said about an older demon teaching a younger demon how to tempt people, the Screwtape Letters. In that book, one of the demons tells the other, says, don't try and make anything that's bad, truly bad. He says, we've been trying since the get-go to make bad, or make something truly bad. He says, but that's not the case. All bad things are merely good things done to the wrong extent or done in the wrong way. And really all of our, if we think about eating, people don't run into problems with eating. You're supposed to eat, you need to eat. But overeating, undereating, just being overly concerned about this, that, or the other thing, that can, or only wanting to eat particular things. We all know people who've gotten in trouble for eating too much of one particular thing that they shouldn't be eating. All of those things, eating those things isn't wrong, but to the quantity or in the way or to the exclusion, that makes it wrong. And the same thing's true with sin. All of our sins, whether it's money or relationships or fame, a good reputation, all of these things are parodies of what God has planned for us, and they often lead us into separation from God. Especially, they will always lead us into separation if we choose to put them above God. And that's exactly what these creatures are doing. They're produced from what Jesus called the father of lies. They come out and they demand to be worshipped. They demand to be enthroned. So the people do worship these things as being the giver of all good things and of power. Now, John himself is having a very specific thing in mind here, isn't he? He's having the Roman Empire, or at the very least, the empires around him that he's thinking about. These empires come in, and this is the way that all empires work. They say, if you just don't worry about things, let us worry about things, all your good things, all good things will happen to you. This is how the Nazis rose to power. By telling the people that, you don't have any problems, the other people caused problems. You just give all your loyalty and obedience to us, and we'll make everything okay. The Romans did the same thing. If we read about the rise of Rome inside the Jewish community, or the Greco-Roman way of life, because the Romans adopted so many Greek policies and practices, then what we see is that there are many people there who feel overawed by the power that is Rome. And so they themselves reject the faith of their ancestors and begin worshiping Rome. Why? Because they think, as Luther talks about idolatry in the commentary to the first commandment in the Large Catechism, they look to this for all refuge from all distress, and for being the giver of all good things. I'm paraphrasing here. I know there are probably some Lutherans out there, so that's not exactly how it's written, but that's the general gist. We look for good things to happen. This is the reason we sin, isn't it? We expect in our sin, none of us go into sin saying, I cannot wait to feel guilty about sinning. I cannot wait to do this bad thing. No, we go into sin because we believe it will give us happiness. We believe if it doesn't give us happiness, it will at least protect us from bad things happening to us. At least the bad people won't come after us. And so that's what John is talking about here with the worship of the beast. It sounds like a god who will protect them, but it's an empty idol. And worse than that, it's got the imprimatur of Satan himself, doesn't it? Now, this beast is often equated with Nero. It arises, we hear, it has 7 heads and 7 horns and 10 crowns, I believe is the number. Those I hope I got those aligned properly. 7 heads, 7 horns, and 10 crowns. Now, what it's trying to talk about here is not like, oh, we have to analyze the 7. Again, John has used 7 so many times, we should be aware of how John uses 7. 7 is the number of completeness. 7 is the number of perfection. So this is a perfectly evil dragon creature. And it has a perfectly evil weapon, its horns. And the 10 just represents a level of completion of its power. One of the heads has been wounded. Most scholars believe this is equated to the Emperor Nero, who himself committed suicide in 68 when things started going not his way. What? Oh,
wow.
yeah. He, and in fact, when you start breaking down the number 666, the best analysis is that the 666, if it aligns up to anybody, it lines up to Nero, and breaking down this number. He killed himself, and we're going to kind of also talk a little bit further as we get along, just how there were some myths surrounding Nero himself. Right. Nero was a persecutor of Christians. The most famous incident was a good portion of the city of Rome burned under mysterious circumstances. Many people say this is what gave rise to what's entered into our language as fiddling while the fire burns. Yeah, because he wasn't playing a fiddle. There's a story that he was playing a lyre and reciting Homer and the fall of Troy as this was happening. There are a lot of these stories. Some of them might have emerged because he really did set fires to this, because wouldn't you know it, in those areas he built a really nice palace in the area that burnt down. So people are like, well, it's kind of beyond coincidence. Other people have stated that he just was an opportunist. It happened, burnt down, there were no fire departments, and so he just thought, well, it must be the providence of the gods that I can build this up. But he started to get a bunch of people angry at him for taking over that land, and then he started spreading the rumor, or the Christians state that he was the one who started spreading the rumor, that it was Christians that had started this fire. And so he himself then started persecuting Christians in earnest as a scapegoat. He eventually would fall foul and feel the need to commit suicide as more and more people grew angry at him. Ironically, not for his killing Christians, but just because he didn't seem to get along with anybody. All right.
So people haven't changed 2,000 years. And
we're still kind of people. So the beast from the sea and the earth. This beast from the earth comes and he compliments the beast from the sea. And this is a parody of the mockery of the lamb, because the beast looks like a lamb, but it speaks with the voice of the dragon. And what happens is it can also perform miracles. There's some debate about the identity, but the best one I've heard is the fact that the beast from the earth is supposed to represent people who are trying to accommodate Rome. So these would be Jewish people trying to accommodate Rome. We see a parallel in this in the intertestamental period, as the Greeks took over over Israel. Alexander the Great's generals took over Israel. His generals started imposing Greek ways of doing things on the Jewish people. And some of the Jewish people capitulated, but some of them resisted. And this would lead to the so-called Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt. And this group of people tried to cast the Greek speakers out of there because they were accommodating to, or that cast out the Greek speakers and also fought against their fellow Jewish people who were accommodating with the Greeks. Here, John appears to be warning that people who accommodate this empire that's coming from over the sea, Rome, that's coming over from over the sea, this group of people that's accommodating this, they may look like lambs, they may appear to be lambs, but in reality they're speaking with the voice of the dragon. But the good news is that's not the end of the story, because as we always see in the book of Revelation, what John does is he lays out in imaginative ways, this is the world in which we find ourselves. This is the world where the 7 churches that he's writing to find themselves. But I've got good news for you folks. That is not even remotely the end of the story. So we have the proclamation of the gospel. We see a complete promise and we see a complete warning coming down from the throne room. It's a representation of pure belief. It is beyond comprehension. The work of the people, therefore, as they gather around the throne, is to praise God who accomplishes all of this. Many of us get the wrong impression about the book of Revelation, that there will be in the cataclysmic battle that will happen between good and evil, we will take up arms and we will be the ones to usher in the kingdom. But what we find is whenever we see people, large groups of people, myriads of myriads who are God's people, the people on God's side, they are not taking up arms. What are they doing? They're praising God and they're praying for justice. They're praying for the ultimate justice that will come when God makes all things new. And I cannot stress this enough. I don't know how many times, you see a movie, not the Bruce Willis movie Armageddon, but you see a movie dealing with, it's Armageddon. And what happens? Well, people have to be tough and they have to be strong and they have to overcome. And the story of Revelation is, no. You just have to praise God because the Lamb has overcome.
Is that also kind of, it's not our place to seek revenge or cast judgment? It's the Lord's?
Right, justice is the Lord's.
Yeah.
And again, when it does talk about, judge not lest you be judged, that's the King James rendering. Actually, a better rendering is, you will be judged by the same way that you've judged. So if you judge someone, it doesn't mean that you're like, well, I'm so afraid of being judged, or I've been judged and forgiven by God, therefore I need to let this person off with, absolutely no repercussions whatsoever because, I'm afraid for my immortal soul. No, what it's saying is,
Right.
if you judge this person in such a way where you're trying to seek vengeance or you're trying to seek power or dominion over this person, then that will be the way you're judged. But if you are judged in a way that looks to try and rescue this person or to prevent evil from happening, then you'll be judged in that way. So it's a heart matter, it's a faith matter. But yes, and that I love how you brought that in, because that is a key thing to remember, is they're all praying for judgment. And we say to ourselves today, because we do live in a very peaceful time, if you just, broadly speaking. I mean, there are so many more of us now that as a percentage, more of us live in peace than at any time previous. So when we live in peaceful times, it's easy for us to think that, as long as I'm not bothering someone's not going to bother me. And in reality, we all live in a community. We all live in relationships with one another. So we can't let ourselves off the hook of looking in on our brothers and sisters, making sure that they're flourishing. And that's the same thing that we see here in this passage. Some of that requires speaking judgment and justice and declaring that the Lord will make all things new, but that means that we need to separate ourselves from evil. And again, we'll kind of circle back to that when we talk about the bulls of wrath. 3 voices fly overhead, and they say 3 things, don't they? They say, God is victorious, the enemies have fallen, so please quit the rebellion. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. That's not exactly, they don't say please, they say quit. Just stop it. Just stop it. Stop being in rebellion. And that's really what we have here. I always find Satan at root. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm not superstitious enough, and I do believe God's powerful enough that I can say this. I always find him a rather comical figure at root. Behind all the genocide and terrors and horrors and just pain and suffering that he's unleashed, big and small, in the world, it's a comical thing to know that you've lost the battle and you're still so delusional that you keep up the fight. Right. I don't, and that makes me feel like there's something about being even the most basic infant. Even a child, a Christian child, knows something that the devil doesn't. And I think that makes me feel good that it's like the old Aesop fable about the hedgehog and the fox. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing.
I don't know the story.
I never heard that either, but I get it.
The devil may know many little things, but the Christian knows one big thing. And so I think that is underscored here. God is victorious. He's won. This is what the cross is. The cross is Christ's victory. He's won. It's over. Battle's done. The enemies have fallen. So please quit the rebellion. Stop it.
Is that why there's so much pain in the world? Is the devil knows that he can't win and he's already lost? The story's over, but he can at least inflict as much pain as possible. And, that might be a good reason that there is, not that...
Well, yeah, it's not just the devil. Luther talks about the devil, the world, and our sinful selves. And as we move on, we'll kind of talk about people. We did talk about, we kind of skipped over the mark of the beast. I can't believe I skipped over the mark of the beast. Everyone wants to know what the mark of the beast is. But the mark of the beast... Sorry, these slides are out of order. The mark of the beast was, most likely, when you were a Roman emperor, one of the main ways to solidify your authority was to mark something very specific. You would have coins marked with your image. And we all know, we think of money as one particular thing, but money is more than that, isn't it? Money bears an image. This is why Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and the Lord what is the Lord's, when people ask if he should pay taxes. He says, well, just give them back what's theirs, but give to God what is God's. The image of Caesar, when a Caesar would take power, either through defeating enemies, and all kings in the ancient world, and really throughout history have done this, they would put their mark on the coinage, so you knew every time you had to pay for anything that the emperor was involved in that transaction in some way, shape, or form. This is also the reason why they wouldn't let they had to have money changers at the temple. The money changers would not. It wasn't so much that they were bankers or anything. They were exchanging coins with the emperor's picture with coins that could be accepted at the temple, that didn't bear the likeness, any graven images, which is against the Ten Commandments. And so what is happening here is he is referencing a couple of Old Testament things. Number one, bearing a graven image, the marking of the beast, but also the way that we talk about the phylacteries, which were these things. When it says, you shall in the Torah it says you shall mark them on your foreheads. A lot of times Jewish people would have these boxes with the Shema, or portions of the Torah, written on scrolls and worn on their foreheads or on their wrists. And so what he's saying is he's comparing having the mark of God, those phylacteries, the mark of the cross later on with Christians, and having the mark of the beast, which is literally buying into the system that Rome is trying to impose on people. And so that is probably the best explanation of the mark of the beast that I can give you. And anyone who uses money unthinkingly in a way that hurts their neighbor, anyone who says it's just business, or I don't really care where I get this stuff from as long as it arrives cheaply and on time. All of the stories that we're reading about these large businesses who have sweatshops overseas. I mean,
children.
Isn't that the mark of the beast? I mean, because you're using the currency of the world to make other people suffer.
Yeah.
All right, so there's a harvest that happens at the end of the world. The harvest motif continues with grace and justice, and this should remind us of Matthew 24-25, Mark 13, and Luke 21. For those of you unfamiliar, this is called Jesus' little apocalypse. These are the passages where Jesus is talking about, two will go out and one will be taken. Of course, this is where we also, the many apocalypses, where we reference portions of the rapture. But if you read what Jesus is talking about, it's not so much that we don't see the people who are taken as being the elect or God's people. Rather, we see the people who are left behind as being God's elect. These passages here are really the only way we can tie that in. The rapture does not exist anywhere in the Bible, and so we just won't talk about it. But anyway, these passages here about the harvest at the end of the world, though, is important. It's also where we get the theme for the grapes of wrath as well, comes from these passages. All right, moving right along. The 7 bowls of wrath. Here we are. This is the final of the 3 sections. We're going to make it. The first bowl, it wounds those who have joined with the beast. These bowls of wrath, it wounds those who have joined with the beast. It's an attack on idolatry. That was the first one. So it's poured out and it causes them to break out in wounds. And what this is talking about is we've seen this change happen, haven't we? As the declaration from the angels has occurred, as the angels have flown overhead and said, it is finished, please stop. The people continue in their ways, and so the vessels of wrath are now clearing up. And we talked about this with the trumpets. We talked about how the trumpets were warnings. When the trumpets were blown, they were warnings of people that God's dominion and justice were at hand. Now, as we're talking about the vessels of wrath, we are talking about how it's come to fruition. The second bowl attacks the seas, and just as we talked about earlier, the first bowl was poured out in the land, the second bowl is poured out in the seas, and the second bowl is poured out on the seas. then the seas begin to have problems. It's an attack on the beast from the sea. So as the previous one was attack on the beast of the land, this one's an attack on the beast of the sea, showing that God's power is powerful enough for both land and sea. And once again, we remember that the attack on the sea is demonstrating God's power over the forces of chaos. When we read back to Genesis, which is also a good book to bear in mind as we're reading this, we see how God has called forth dry land from the sea. He's separated the seas, and He has caused life to exist in between those seas. We still see this a bit today. We call people who fly up into space astronauts, sailors out there in the cosmos. Or if you're Russian, then you call them cosmonauts. But it's the same thing. It's nautical, and it's this notion that this is the sea above us, and there's a great sea below us, and that God has separated this out for life to exist. And people say, well, God could do that and all, but He's not having dominion over the seas. Now we're finding out that yes, indeed, God does have dominion over those things as well. This, of course, hurts shipping and shows God's dominion over that primordial chaos, like what I just said. Now, another bowl is poured out over the springs. This demonstrates that God has power to shut off the life-giving springs that emanate from the world. It demonstrates the power that people say, well, I can live my life without God. I can live my life without the provision of God. And now, what God is saying by pouring wrath upon these springs is, no, I have dominion over this which creates life as well. People, we are told, still refuse to repent. Next, we are told that the sun is burnt. The vial is poured over the sun, and it burns people. This is divine punishment that comes from the sky. So we've seen 4 natural entities where God has shown His dominion. We've seen it over land, we've seen it over seas, we've seen it over the life-giving springs of the earth, now we're seeing it up in the sky. There's no place these people can run. And once again, they fail to be repentant. Once again, the passages divide pretty neatly. 7 is a number of completion. It's meant to show the complete dominance of God over everything that we can experience. And now, as we pass through God's dominion over the natural world, we're going to see God's dominion over the world that human beings create. So, again, we've talked about how the beast's throne is a parody. It's a parody of God's enthronement. We've been talking about the throne room of God all throughout this. And now we're seeing that the beast has set up his own throne, just as any kind of potentate in the ancient world would set up a throne demanding to be served, to be worshipped. And so now God is saying that I can send my angels over this throne to destroy it. It's very interesting what happens next. One scholar has stated that this parallels the upper levels of creation. If we go through the book of Genesis, there's the natural world which is created, and then when we get to verse 5, the upper levels of creation are created. So here, it's not just talking about everything in a fallen world. Now we're talking about things that are willfully disobedient to God. This also foreshadows the beast's darkness. And notice also what happens here is that everyone who worshipped the beast, now, because the beast has been attacked, they themselves become attacked. And what this is trying to tell us is that whatever we worship, ultimately when God's judgment comes upon it, when we look for it for ultimate happiness, it's going to hurt us as well when that thing fails to come through. And we don't even have to see that in its completed end times glory. We can see that right now in our own lives. We all know people's lives that have been destroyed when they have sought pleasure or have sought money or have sought positions of power, when they've given themselves over fully, and then the bill comes to justice is done. And so just as the beast, when its throne is destroyed, when our idol, the throne of the idols in our hearts are destroyed, our lives begin to collapse as well. And we need to ask for repentance in those moments. Next, we see that the bowl, a vial is poured out on the Euphrates. We talked earlier about how the Euphrates was not just the life-giving river of many of the Middle Eastern empires, like Babylon and Assyria and what have you. It was also the borderland that Rome considered its ultimate final border. And here, with this pouring out, now it's dry land. It looks as if God's plan isn't going to work out, because now the forces of chaos have started to gather on the other side of the Euphrates. John's really trying to say a couple of things here, though. He's saying, if you look for your help in Rome with the beast, you're going to be disappointed, to say the least. But if you look for your salvation to come from the other side of the Euphrates, from outside of Rome, you will just find chaos. And doesn't that parallel a little bit with the first two horsemen? You have either a controlled, mechanistic one, like the dictatorships, the totalitarian regimes of the mid-20th century, which combined the industrial mechanization with the wholesale killing of humanity, versus the chaotic powers of war itself, of cruel war, of the whirlwind just at the door. And what John is trying to say is now finally the two sides, the chaos and the radical organization of war, finally meet with the Euphrates dried up.
Does the Euphrates still exist today?
Yes. Yes.
And right up there.
Yeah, it's, what's
Yes.
Baghdad. Baghdad's on the Euphrates. They're allowed to join the three unclean. Again, John is trying to drove right past that. What John's trying to say there is the fact that there's that blurred line between it's all evil powers, whatever you're putting your hope in that's not God is still a power at rebellion with God, and sooner or later will join together. Second thing he's trying to say there is, there was a story we talked about Nero at the outset. Many people said, well, Nero didn't really die. Nero just disappeared into the east, and he's going to lead a bunch of people from the east to overthrow all the citizens of Rome and all the peoples of Rome. So there was this myth, this children's story, if you will, that this was going to happen. John is tapping into it, saying, you know, it does make a little bit of sense. If he's not dead, then he does kind of represent the beast and so forth, and it would make sense that it would tie in with that children's story that he's going to lead a group of Parthians to overrun civilization. So let's talk about Armageddon. For those of you interested, that's where Armageddon is.
Is that Israel?
It is. That's
Okay.
called the Plains of Megiddo.
Okay.
There is no mountain of Megiddo, by the way. The use of the word mountain is meant to designate just a point to think about, or a large mountain being the dwelling place of God. But there are no mountains there. This is a very interesting spot. One of the most interesting things we'll see about Israel is it's located right at a hub, at a nexus between a north and south and east and west division in the ancient world. There in Israel, it's not really good land, but it's worth a lot, just in the same way that maybe the land where a freeway or a railroad is going isn't good land, but it becomes worth a lot because there's a lot of stuff that's transported across it. And that's the same thing here. So Israel has this, but this particular spot is a relatively flat land. It has a lot of grazing. Anybody who knows the history of the military understands that if you have a lot of grazing land, you can feed a lot of horses, which means you can field large armies of cavalry. And many scholars believe that Megiddo is one of the top places in the world that's been fought over. It's been fought over and over again. In fact, we have numerous times in the Bible where it's recorded. Deborah's victory happens here in Judges chapter 5:19. Solomon fortifies it, we're told in 1 Kings 9:15. Kings Uzziah and Josiah perish in these particular passages. And it's a place of grief. Again, here's our old friend Zechariah writing to us again. Zechariah, who really should, I think, sue John for plagiarism for a lot of what goes on in Zechariah. But here he's talking about this place will be a place of grief, but ultimately of victory as well. The peoples then are caught up in the middle of these powerful earth forces. And this is another thing John is trying to remind us, that what we see are the world trying to tell us, this is it, you better go along with us, or otherwise your life will be meaningless. You cannot fight us. We're bigger than that. And what John is trying to say, there's a bigger, greater, grander story than the one that the world is talking about. The people are told to be prepared because God is coming. Wrote twice. Now God says, it is finished. God's brought about the end, or the beginning of the end. What's interesting here is the word, it is finished. Here, I double-checked my Greek. This word is gegenin. And gegenin means it has happened. It has happened. It seems weird because the word genomai, where it comes from, means it can be a beginning. So this is literally the beginning of the end. He has brought about the beginning of the end. The end has begun and the people cannot escape. And that's what happens. The bowl is poured out. The city of Babylon is divided into three and cannot rise. And that should be right where we end.